Are they still waiting?
Okay.
Signed off. I'll have a look now, so I can see what.
Right. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of Audit and Governance Committee. My name is Councillor Holly. I'll be chairing the committee this evening. A special thank you to our new independent person, who's Miles Binney. So welcome. I know this isn't your first meeting, but it's the first sort of meeting of audit and governance on its own. So thank you for your time, and you're very welcome. And I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it, and hopefully we'll get more out of you. So thank you. Usual housekeeping things. I think we all know where the toilets are, what to do if there's a fire, etc. I'll say in terms of the agenda, it's a very big agenda, so feel free to hold your questions and send an email later on if that would be possible. Also to officers presenting, I'm very happy if your presentation is limited to anything extra we need to be told over and above what's in the report. I sort of hesitate to say that I'm sure everybody's read every page of the 400, but I think we can assume we have done. So thank you for your assistance in trying to keep the meeting reasonably long. I think Councillor Mason is running slightly late, but will no doubt join us when he can. But if we move on to the agenda then, so item 1 is declarations of interest. So if any members have got any declarations to make? No? Minutes and the action log then of the last meeting. Are there any issues members would like to raise with the minutes? Councillor Melly?
Thank you, Chair. On page 8 of the papers, minute 29 about publication of internal audit reports, you remember we went slightly off topic and talked about confidential papers in general, not just audit reports, and talked about kind of member access to that information, which we refer to as pink papers usually. So in the minutes at the moment, it says that members would need to demonstrate that they have a need to know for the purposes of their duty as a councillor and no other. From my recollection, that no other bit wasn't kind of necessarily accurately what's said. I don't think we were told there was a requirement to prove that there's no other interest in accessing the papers other than your. It's difficult to prove a negative, if you want to see some pink papers relating to the sale of a care home or something, you don't have to prove that you have no interest in care homes other than it being in your ward, for example. So I didn't feel like that was entirely accurate.
We're happy as a committee to just remove the words and no other.
Yeah.
Generally, yep, Councillor Milling.
And in that same paragraph, sorry. So as it's minuted, that was kind of quoting kind of the law, I think, about need to know in terms of access to information. But then also, so here it's quoted what the monitoring officer said, saying that in law, if we can demonstrate a need to know, then we can access information. But as kind of extra context to kind of quantify that and give extra context to it, we were also told, this is a quote, members generally will have access to pink papers. I think that is kind of important context to add to that statement in that paragraph.
Yep.
That's all right.
I'm sure we're happy to add that. I think hopefully the Constitution review will be able to pick up some of the issues around the access to pink papers and hopefully codify that a bit more going forward. Are there any more comments? Not. If we're happy for me to sign them, I'll do that. There's also then the action log. Councillor Melly.
Sorry, Chair, not related to the minutes for this meeting that we've just approved, but while we're on the subject of minutes, could we as a committee seek to find out the status of the minutes from the last meeting we had, which was a joint meeting with the CCSMC Scrutiny Committee meeting, and find out if they've been signed off already, and if not, whether we can have view of them, or just kind of find out what the status of those minutes are, please.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a look. They're still under construction, so they've not been gone anywhere yet or been approved anywhere. But I'll have a conversation with Jane and I'll find out the best place for them to go to be signed off.
And I suspect there will be another one of those meetings to finish the job. So it may be that the best place
they would just go there.
Would go to there. Although then what happens with the minutes of that meeting?
Yeah.
was the question, Bob.
The chair is asked that meeting where it would like the second set of meeting the minutes to be agreed.
That makes sense.
Chair, in relation to the action log, I hope members find an action log like this useful compared to where the situation was. But back onto one of my regular hobby horses, where something has a column headed to be completed by, and it's a gap, every one of those needs a completion date. And if the completion date's not being met, then there should be a note to say it needs a revised completion date, because that's the only way that members can be kept updated with what's going on, because a blank doesn't tell them anything about how it's being processed.
Thank you. And yes, I think it's important if we could update that, and then we can just, you know, it's not necessarily a problem if things do slip, but it is useful to then keep an eye on when things are expected, you know, particularly for our work plan as well. And I've learned as well, I'm supposed to be exploring the open data platform with the business intelligence team, so I should probably do that. Any other issues then on the action log? Mr. Rose?
No issues, but since it's not anywhere else on the agenda, it might be worth just getting a status update on where we're at with the working group for the Constitution, just for public records.
I think that is in the agenda somewhere.
It's scheduled to come back to this committee next meeting.
Yeah, I just thought it would be useful having a
Yeah, I think
where we got up
I
to.
can have, you know, the members of the anyway.
it's behind.
Some laptops. Yes, so as I say, I can happily give an update. We have a couple of members of the committee sat on here, obviously, present. We are, I believe, 14 pages into the council procedure rules after 3 meetings. So we're making slow but steady progress. Sorry.
We're up to B1 for anybody who
Yes.
wants to know how far we progress. We are doing it sequentially, so.
We're doing it absolutely sort of line by line so that nothing is missed as we go through it, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you to those members sacrificing your time for that. It's much appreciated. Right then, if we're all happy with those, then we'll move on to our public participation. I think we've got one speaker today, which is Gwen Swinburne. And Gwen, if you'd like to take the spot. You'd like to make a start in your own time, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's good to see the peer review item appear in public. Thank you, Chair. I consider myself a stakeholder when it comes to governance and culture and capacity for improvement. I have a constructive contribution to make. I have been invited previously to contribute on these efforts, given my extensive background and long-term engagement, well over a decade now, with this authority on governance matters. I can help. I saw the usual great and good suspects listed as stakeholders, but it excluded any citizens in our own right. This seems quite odd and very conservative, considering especially the leadership seems to want to focus on customer experience and economic development. As you are well aware, core governance and culture failings are at the root of what is so wrong at City of York Council. After a decade, they basically remain unchanged, other than we have a best-in-class webcast and public participation policy in practice. These failings fall mainly under the control of the Chief Operating Officer's department. You can't plan as the forward plan is not fit for purpose. Forward procurement is opaque and chaotic. Key decision protocols are ignored or abused. Officer decision delegations and their decision recording is haphazard at best, unlawful at worst. Democratic services and scrutiny functions are so underpowered and under-resourced as to make it very difficult to provide any more than a most minimal service. So-called consultations are appalling, with non-favoured few completely ignored. I could go on, but you know the problems. But I fear once again the LGA peer review won't address them for the far sexier and easier customer journey. Perhaps in that regard, you might ask how calling us customers is in any way respectful. We are as much stakeholders as anyone in the city, but the authority chooses to diminish us in this by calling us customers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And obviously we'll get to that item, hopefully not too long. We move on then to item 4, which is the report of the monitoring officer. Bryn, if you'd like to.
Thank you, Chair. In the spirit of your opening comments, I don't think I've got anything to add to it at present, so I'm happy to take any comments. I suppose the only thing I would note is that obviously I understand you've had a slightly revised resolution in relation to the external audit reports circulated. So whilst the majority of it hopefully will be signed this evening, there is an outstanding issue, which means that we can't conclude them this evening. But we will still be in a fairly unique position.
Okay, thank you. Can we invite any questions then for the monitoring officer on his report? Councillor Rose and then Councillor Melly.
Yeah, it was possibly a question for the committee, but possibly for Bryn, which is just on page 23. It talks about the member induction programme, and I wondered which committee has oversight of it and might want to start looking at the compliance level and feedback and what we can do to improve that going forwards. Not expecting any changes to councils anytime soon, but it's good to look at it.
Absolutely, Chair. The answer is this committee. The original programme was brought to this committee for its views and its agreement. You are fortunate to have in the audience the officer who actually led on developing that. So you've got somebody listening who can actually hear that. I'm sure that if you would like a report back on where we are in terms of compliance levels, that can be managed quite easily because it's all recorded electronically.
It's a conversation for the work plan, I think.
Councillor Melly.
I think a certain level of review of the induction programme and attendance at it and kind of feedback and review of it has been to joint standards. Is anyone on joint standards? I'm not on joint standards.
Okay. We're not sure, I think is the answer. We'll have a look.
But for record, Chair, this is the appropriate committee to consider that, so we can add that to the forward work programme.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. Councillor Fisher. Oh, Councillor Melly.
Thank you for the report. Paragraph 3 says, since the previous report, council has successfully conducted whole council elections. We had another agenda item with the same title, report of the monitoring officer, on the 19th of July. I wasn't sure if this report serves a different purpose, the report on the 19th of July, or whether this.
Turn that back on. No, this is just ensuring that this is sort of my overall annual sort of look back over the last sort of 12 months. So if there's a duplication, it's the same set of elections, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor Rose?
Yeah, just to follow up, I can see it on the notes on page 12 of the minutes of the 21st of November. Does that mean it should be joint standards in terms of conversations around changes and going forward, or should that be us? I guess to some extent it's about compliance. To some extent, I'm more thinking about what we can learn and improve.
This committee has had the overall oversight of the programme. Joint standards may then be interested in, if people haven't done required training, then what steps should be taken. But obviously this is probably the right place to look at how did it work? Was it what you needed? Was there anything else that you needed in it? Was there too much of something? So as I say, well, we can happily bring a report back here and you can have that sort of conversation about where you want it to go next.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that would be useful, and yeah, the sooner, I guess, the better before memories fade too much. Okay, there's no.
This is very brave of me to talk about what happened at joint standards, but I think one point that was raised there is the difficulty where an issue has salience to two different committees, and one has primacy, but how does the other committee feed in? And I think there was definitely a feeling within joint standards that it would be reasonable for a committee to feed something into the responsible committee, saying it may be your responsibility, but we think you should look at A, B, C, D, E, or whatever, as Because if you have barriers which says it's the other committee that thinks of it, that creates problems that things get lost along the way, because those who have a particular perspective ought to feed in to the parent committee their issues. It's an information item, if nothing else.
That's Rose.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think we should be trying to gain that knowledge and input now, because the temptation is to leave it until, you know, you're approaching an election and you've lost all the memory of what was good and what wasn't and what could have worked better. Noting as well that the minutes of the November meeting said it would return in January, but it did not return today. So it might be worth a prompt to joint standards that they were going to review the attendance levels, I guess.
Okay, well, perhaps if they've got a meeting before our next meeting, something could be popped on their agenda, asking them to, if there are any issues they'd like to sort of elevate in our direction.
Well, so thank you. Just a quick one from me, Brent. If I may, this is my first committee. I think this has been covered up previously. Notice that you did have a backlog of FOI requests, and that has now been cleared over a few months period. Are you confident now that that's on a sustainable footing, given the capacity constraints mentioned here?
So my own view would be that the answer to that is yes, on the basis that receiving the enforcement notice is something of a wake-up call. And certainly the level of senior input that went into dealing with that was such that it's unlikely to slip off. Add to that the fact that we're now receiving regular updates from the IG team in relation to current performance on FOI requests to the corporate management team. So we can see when things, or if things look like they're slipping, and direct attention accordingly.
Brilliant. And just one follow-up, if I may. Is there a metric overseen by this committee or another one, just to sort of keep an eye on quarterly on FOI levels?
So this committee receives a regular report from the corporate governance team, which will deal with all of those.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of paragraph 8, is there a mechanism by which feedback can be given, I guess, to the government about the process we went through trying to produce the constitution for the Combined Authority? Because I think it'd be fair to say it was unsatisfactory for certainly members on our council. I know that's not the fault of officers, that's the kind of government thing, leaving everything until the last minute, and then there's no opportunity to kind of you know, work into that sort of plan because it's all, you know, everything's got to be done next week. Is there a way of kind of feeding that back to the government, just sort of trying to raise the issue, just to, you know, what's difficult and sort of unsexual, you know,
I'll be honest, Chair, the answer is I don't know, but we can certainly inquire. Obviously, we have contacts in DLUC who dealt with this, so we can certainly inquire of them as to whether there's any feedback process that we can follow through.
Yeah,
it was all a bit last minute, as far as we were concerned.
Yeah, I think it'd be useful to know if there is a feedback process, and then perhaps we could consider as a committee what feedback we would like to give.
I'll take that away as an action to look into it, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Mason.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose on a similar vein with all the work we put into going through that constitution, obviously you've got the review going on at the minute. How does the process, I suppose, of working backwards on our constitution, where there's bits that are tangled up that might now contradict with the new constitution of the Combined Authority powers or duties or whatever, how does that all get unravelled or worked out?
Ultimately, Chair, once the Combined Authority constitution is completely finalised, insofar as they ever are, and particularly once the mayor is in place and therefore there are no substantial changes to be made, then it's I fear back to the constitution working group for us to go through those elements that are impacted by powers that have been transferred to the Combined Authority, to just make sure that they all dovetail together.
Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you, Chair. And just as a supplementary to that, obviously the Combined Authority itself will have an audit and governance committee in addition. Will the same rules be applying there, and we'll have to accept, sort of deal with the appropriate crossover as and when, or will there be any different case between the two?
What do you mean the same rules, Councillor?
Sorry, the constitutional alignment I meant that Councillor Mason spoke about.
So obviously theirs will be a new constitution, so it will just say what it needs to. Because it is gaining some powers from us, then we will need to ensure that our constitution doesn't include us exercising powers that are no longer sat with us. So really, it's I won't say one-way street, but it's an exercise where once they've got what they need in their constitution, we can then look through ours and go, well, that bit's no longer relevant, that's no longer relevant, and we can remove those.
I can think of no finer place than to raise the awkward issue of a new body which consists of members of two existing bodies and an independently elected individual. How do the members of the new body, who are members of an existing body, account for, or what support are they given to enable them to ensure that that new body accounts for its dealings? It's a two-tier structure that's being created, and the new body is a creature of the two existing bodies, but with an independent elected mayor, and some scope for accountability and constitutional difficulties in the way the new body, not the new mayor specifically, but the new body relates to the pre-existing two bodies. And in the middle of your constitutional review, which some of you are involved in, you could almost do with a placeholder, which is, how are we guys going to relate to those guys? Our representatives, how are they going to relate back to the parent authority? I'm glad I'm not doing it, but I think there needs to be something in there.
Councillor Rose?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of things that already exist for a lot of pre-existing mayoral authorities. I think we've got a really weird, unique situation around the fact that we're two entities and there's a disproportionate population, which means that we get half of the seats when we're not half of the population. But likewise, the independent mayor is going to be predominantly voted on by North Yorkshire. And I think that the relationships are similar to all the other outside bodies we have, where we're putting people in there to represent us, but they're also representing themselves in that space. I think it's not unique to all the other situations where we do have people representing York Council, but also representing the body they're placed into. So I'm a director of City York Trading and I'm a governor to the NHS hospital, and I'm in that role in that organisation, but I'm also a councillor. But I do think it is something we should be looking at from a working group perspective of what do we need to do to make sure we've got the appropriate relationship enshrined in our constitution, not just enshrined in theirs, for sure.
Okay, I love that. Add that to the list. I think Councillor Melly and I have both been on WICA scrutiny committees in the past, so it'll be a similar thing, but and that's always a bit weird because we're not there as sort of proper full members. We're kind of observers more than anything, but yeah, I'm sure that's one you'll enjoy getting your teeth into. Okay, we've finished there. Then if we could move on to item 5, which is the LGA peer challenge. Thank you for joining us, and yes, if there's anything in particular you'd like to highlight or any sort of update you'd like to give, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things really. First of all, I've provided you with a report, a list of interviewees and the scope. Thank you to the resident, Ms Swinburne, for the offer of speaking to the LGA. The LGA provided us with quite a prescriptive list of the types of interviews they wanted to have, so we responded to the LGA's requests. Just to note an error, and apologies for this, on paragraph 10, it notes that the peer challenge will be presented to executive in April. There's a good chance it'll be in pre-election period, and therefore it'll be in May rather than April. But I don't have anything. I'm noting your request to have a short report, so that's as short as I can make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies, I should have introduced you as Claire Fong, the Assistant Director of
Policy and Strategy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if there are any questions then on the peer review, Councillor Melly.
Thank you. Annex A, the agreement of scope of peer challenge, is from October. So there were some gaps back then that I'm hoping have been filled now. So for example, it says the council will need to identify a peer challenge coordinator. Has that person been appointed now?
That is me.
Thank you. Excellent, thank you. And the list of what are they called? Interviewees.
Yes.
I agree with the public speaker that residents are stakeholders, So I can see how that might be a slightly difficult stakeholder to engage with in such a kind of short time period when there's so many stakeholders to engage with. I was just wondering if that's been thought about at all. Yeah.
We were led by the local government association as to who they wanted to speak to, so I didn't challenge the list. I certainly can go back and ask them the question.
Can I ask another question? Yeah. This list of interviewees, are they all confirmed now? Was this a kind of desired list of people to invite, or is this a confirmed list of people who will be interviewed?
This is a confirmed list.
And the list of TECALs, yeah, them. I was just wondering how, were all of them invited, but the ones on this list are the only ones who agreed to take part, or were only a few selected for some reason?
They're the only ones we chose, I think, but only on the basis of trying to keep the diary manageable for the peer reviewers.
In that case, how were they chosen? Do you know?
There wasn't any kind of strategic approach to it. It's kind of based on availability, really. So who was available on the Thursday that the peer reviewers were speaking to people.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Chair, there's a context to governance in York with which you have been involved relatively recently. There's nothing in here which suggests that our problems, which we had in governance over a couple of years, which produced a problem with our audited accounts, are those being looked at, revisited, included as part of this exercise? You know, have we learned from our problems, and are we delivering in the context of our problems an improvement?
So thank you for that. The peer reviewers asked for more information about the public interest reports, both of them, previous peer challenge and action plans, and the action plan that followed the previous peer review, the one we've just had, the previous public interest report, and also the 10 recommendations from the Local Government Association that were presented to Audit and Governance in January, I want to say. So they've already asked for that information, and it's forming part of their evidence base to the basis of the questions that they'll be asking through interview.
Thank you. Councillor Mason?
I just wondered what under city partners, it says inclusive global / equalities. Just wondered, what does that mean? Everyone else above that is quite specific in terms of Chief Executive, North Yorkshire, and Police Director.
So are you asking me who Inclusive Global are? So Inclusive Global are working with us to help us understand where we sit on the Local Government Association Diversity, Equality and Inclusive DIA framework. And it assesses local authorities against the sort of set of criteria from poor to excellent, and based on where we are, obviously that will lead to an action plan. So it's really providing a objective and outside view on our approach to equalities in inclusivity.
So when it says inclusive growth / equality, is equalities another group of people, or is that?
It's the same person who's doing that conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? No. Councillor Mason.
I suppose just off the back of what Rachel, Councillor Melly was saying, I think it would be useful even if residents could make written submissions in some way, some form, I think, of residents feeling they can engage with it at some point, or at least make some representation, whether it's read, whatever, whether it's actual. I think that's important that that channel is there. So if you could feed that back, that'd be appreciated. And particularly if there's evidence of residents being involved in the past.
Sorry, can you say that again? I did not catch the last bit.
Specifically, if residents have been involved in the past, it would feel, you know, good to keep that thread.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it'd be useful as well in terms of the wider, you know, sort of backbench councillors, because I think the list we've got is quite sort of, you know, senior heavy. So it would be useful, I think, to, I don't know whether an email can go out to all councillors saying if you've got any views that you'd like to be fed in, or, you know, we're kind of having to, as a group, you know, produce ad hoc meetings to feed into the one or two of us which have been kind of invited to the scrutiny chairs one, when actually it might be useful to try and get a wider view, particularly as quite a lot of the backbench councillors now are, were until recently, doing different jobs, and will probably have a view on how things are sort of progressing, or anything that might be useful. So I think in terms of that, and then the sort of opportunities for the wider public, that'd be useful for the sort of reviewers to hear from.
Chair, I would absolutely agree with your view that given this is a statutory authority, allowing the opportunities of the members of statutory authorities to comment on anything is a very reasonable position to take. I would caution against self-selecting members of the public being asked if they would like to comment on something, because they are not a representative sample of the public. The backbench councillors have been elected as members of the council and have a very clear statutory involvement in the process. But I do think self-selection by an individual who wishes to be involved in this process isn't particularly helpful, unless you simply say that there is time for people to consider just written contributions without a two-way involvement in the development of the process.
Yeah, I think you just have to be careful that you're not, those people are not then assumed to be representative of the public. They are people that are interested in the process for whatever reason and have a view from the outside that it might be useful to be heard, but they're not the public by definition, because there's 200,000 people out there that are not remotely interested in our meeting. That's Councillor Rose.
Some people in this room probably. Yeah, I echo all those points. I think we need to be cautious of telling them how to do their job when they do this job across lots of councils. But if we genuinely want this to try and unearth anything that we can improve as a council, and in general, that's a good policy, but certainly it's a good policy when you're trying to find any efficiencies you can find in tight times. I think, backbench councillors certainly, and members of the public certainly, also lower level council officers, also independent people on committees. And there's a lot of these groups where they'll just have a different perspective. They'll see things that people higher up might not. I think you understand what we're thinking in the room, and you can take that away. But I guess, I echo those points that you might not necessarily get a definitive truth of what's happening on the ground all the time when you're interviewing only the seniors. So.
Yeah, that just reminded me of the trade unions involved at all. Or?
I thought they were. Hang on, let me just check. No.
Okay. I think it'd be useful to speak to somebody there. No, sorry.
If I'll just briefly jump in, Chair. The one thing I think members perhaps need to consider is the timescale for production of all of this. So the peers will arrive on the Monday morning, and essentially they are working non-stop until Friday afternoon, when they'll be delivering their sort of high-level overview of what they've found. So there is just a danger of somewhat overwhelming them if effectively you then say, well, absolutely anybody can email in, because they just won't have the time to go through them. It's just the practicality of, if you've got 4 and a bit days, they've got to sleep at some point, they've got a bloot and all the rest. So I absolutely understand the sentiment. I think there's just a practicality question. Now, there will be then a follow-up full report, which may be able to take some of that stuff into consideration, because that will not arrive for a number of months.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's their process, and it should be led by them if it's to be seen as a sort of independent report. But I think it's useful, raising these issues, I guess, with them, and they can either say, "Oh, yes, that's a good idea," or they can say, "No, we're not interested," and that's fair enough. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed there's a lot of involvement with various groups within York. There's involvement with North Yorkshire Council. I don't see any opportunity for parish and town councils to put an input into this. After all, they have a huge liaison with the city council as the parent authority. I'm not sure how you would do that, but I wonder if there's some mechanism by which the views of parish and town councils could be involved.
I think that's perhaps one to add to the list of people we're suggesting it might be useful for them to engage with, that is put to them, and they can say yes or no, and that's our view, I think, is it would be useful to speak to all these groups as part of, you know, to get a rounded view of what is happening in York, but ultimately it's for them to decide, I think. So I think that's probably the best we can really do at this point. Okay.
Just to echo, I'll feed this all back to the local government association, but it is their process. So yeah, they might say, yeah, great. Or they might say, well, actually, so I'll see what they say and feedback if there's anything. You'll hear from me if there's anything further, because I'll need information from you, but otherwise, yeah, it's up to the local government association, it's their review.
Okay.
Just to add to a conversation around member induction. So this forms one of the responses to one of the 10 recommendations, which went to A&G from the local government association back in January, as does the member induction review. And I'm due to report that back to this group in May. And I wondered if you wanted to wait till May or whether you wanted to bring member induction earlier.
I think we'll be looking at the work plan later and how
Okay.
how we'll sort of, you know, be able to slot that in. It's probably useful to bring that at the same time, and maybe May is a good time to aim to sort of have a look at that work. Councillor Rose?
Yeah, I noticed since then that it is in the forward plan already for May, and May is our next meeting, so there's no
Fine.
time to bring it earlier. I don't think it's, yeah, I think that's as good as it can be, probably.
Okay, that's fine.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Not the induction and training aspect is on the forward plan for the next meeting. Bringing the other things in line with that would make sense.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, so if we can move on then to item 7. Item 6. Yes, you've caught me out there. Okay, which is the audit completion report. And I believe we do have Mazars with us. If you're able to give us any update, apologies.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just take the report as read and just go through highlight the relevant areas. So section 2 of the report gives us the status update, and it's in a better position than it has been for quite a few years. The only thing that we're really waiting for now is the pensions assurance from North Yorkshire Pension Fund auditor. We spoke to Deloitte and they're on with that work at the moment. As soon as we get that letter, that confirmation, we'll review it. Hopefully there'll be no issues in there, which means we can finalise the 22-23 accounts. The other steps on there are just our generic close down steps. The other area of the report is the significant findings in section 4, starting page 54. Here we highlight the significant risks that we included in our audit plan at the beginning of the year. Again, there's nothing particularly significant come out of the testing for those areas. We have noted some errors in regard to, well, it wouldn't be an audit, asset valuations, property valuations later on in the report. And again, we've just said we can't quite conclude on the defined benefit liability valuation just yet, because we need that letter from Deloitte. The other page I was going to highlight was page 59. We discussed some significant matters with management. The most interesting of which was probably the rack concrete and the impact on your valuations. There wasn't any issue from that. And the pension asset ceiling. Again, you'll notice that there's been a significant change in the pension values within the balance sheet. On page 61, we highlight the internal control recommendations. This year we made 3 new ones, 2 of them being high priority. The first one is in regard to the insurance cover for heritage assets. The second one being around the valuation of the HRA stock. Essentially, this was valued on the 1st of April, but 21-22's accounts were still open. So at the stroke of midnight, we thought, well, it's a bit unusual that the valuations have gone up by 90 million on that day. So we consulted with our own Mazars internal valuers, who consulted with your valuers, and they decided to rerun those valuations, which has resulted in some adjustments to both 21 and 21-22 and 22-23's accounts. The other recommendation was just around making sure that capitalised costs were recorded in the correct year. And again, you'll see that there was an error noted unadjusted. We did follow up on some previous years' internal control recommendations, but again, we've had management's responses from those, and we'll be working with them in the current year to resolve any issues from those. Summary of misstatements, page 72 onwards. We have got the one unadjusted misstatement, which links back to that control recommendation around capitalisation costs, just making sure things are recognised in the right year. What gets us up on a morning, isn't it, Mark? And then the unadjusted misstatements, again, there's three big ones in there. One of them being the £60 million for the HRA property we've just discussed earlier. The second one on there is around Allerton Waste Recycling Plant. Again, our Mazars valuers consulted with your valuers, and it was decided a little bit extra work was needed to get comfort over that value, resulting in that increase of 9.5 million. And again, the other one on there, £11 million, no impact on the financial position of the authority. It was just a technical accounting adjustment. Section 7 goes on to discuss our value for money arrangements. The plan is to complete our annual auditors report for the next committee. And what we're probably going to do is combine 21-22 and 22-23's commentary in one report for this next committee. And as of yet, that work hasn't been finalised, but we do expect to follow up on previously reported weakness around the public interest report. Then it's the appendices, which provides you with the draft management representation letter and the audit report that we hope we'll be issuing quite soon once we get the pension fund assurance. So I don't propose to say anything else and just ask if there's any questions.
Thank you. Councillor Mason.
Thanks. It might not be one for you, but I was interested that we ensure the art collection, given it's in the custody of an independent trust. And I was wondering if that was usual, unusual. Just seemed like a bit of an anomaly that, yeah.
I can answer that, Councillor Mason. Even though it's looked after by the York Museums Trust, it's still owned by the City of York Council, so it still belongs to us.
So they have no kind of insurance liability for anything in that respect, or it's not doubly insured, or?
No, it's owned by the City Council, and therefore it's our responsibility.
Okay.
Okay. Any further questions? If not, then I'll thank you for your work on this. I'm sure it's an enormous job. Appreciate some apologies. It's sort of hidden away down the side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just the question on what happens with the recommendation in terms of how they're then scrutinised later downstream. When do we then see what the recommendations have turned into in terms of actions from the council on that? In terms of, for example, all the internal control recommendations, page 63 onwards.
Do you want to take that?
It's part of the next year's August.
Yeah, I was just wondering, obviously you've got the recommendation there, when do we see what those actions have become from a council perspective? Because those recommendations really are accepted by us as things we want to do. Sorry, that was a bit late in the questions for that section, but.
No, we've probably lost the officer who could give you an answer, so.
No, in terms of the actions from the audit completion report. Yeah, we'll be doing those now, and we'll be working with Mazars throughout the year. We're about to start, obviously, this year's accounts close down, so those actions will be completed for this year's accounts close down, and Mazars will come back and tell you if we haven't done them.
Yeah, so they come back in the next report rather than coming back at any point for us to see what actions are and whether we think.
We wouldn't come and ask you because they're accounting recommendations, so no disrespect, but we won't come and ask you whether you think we're doing the right thing, because we'll agree with Mazars what the correct thing to do is, because they're accounting recommendations. Does that make sense? And so you'll see in the report that we've just been through, Mark mentioned the new ones and then an update on the ones from the previous year, so it'll be the same again next year. Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Burton.
It was regarding page 74. And I think it was about the insurance checks and the fact that things had been undervalued in one of the years. And I know it's a bit of pernickety, but how did that happen? And you recommended that it won't happen again. And I wonder, how can you be sure?
I can answer that one, and Helen can help me out on that. It was a human error. It was an administrative error. We have a manager and an officer, and the manager was on sick leave or on leave, and so the officer dealt with it. And unfortunately, neither Helen, myself, anybody else was around to check that they'd sent the right schedule. And so we're very sorry about that. But we have now put in place arrangements to make sure that somebody else does always check the schedule when it's sent.
That sounds great then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If we move on then to item 7, which is the statement of the council. I believe this is the one where we've got an amended recommendation. Just
Yes, that's right.
explain that for us. That'd
Yeah.
be really helpful.
So this does follow on from the audit completion report that Mazars have just presented, and ordinarily we'd then provide the final set of accounts for this committee to receive and approve, and then for the chair to sign off. Because of the pensions issue that Mark has highlighted, and the fact that we haven't got the audit certificate from Deloitte, we're unable to therefore present the accounts for signing at this committee. So the proposal of the recommendation is, assuming that there would be no issues highlighted by this committee, we propose that the chair is delegated the authority to approve and sign the accounts outside of this committee at the point when the pension certificate has been received. It's something that was done for the 21-22 accounts that were ongoing as well.
Okay, thanks. So just because I don't think members have seen the revised wording. So it's essentially to delete recommendation B and replace it with delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the vice chair to approve and sign the final statements of accounts by resolution of this committee in accordance with the Accounts and Audit Regulation 2015, subject to the only amendments being related to the pensions fund as a result of the NYPF audit. So assuming we're all relatively happy with that when it comes to it, that'll be the formal recommendation. So thank you for that. And if there's anything else on the report you'd like to draw our attention to.
Only to say that these accounts are the same set of accounts that were received by this committee in July of last year, with the amendments that have taken place that Mazars have mentioned during the audit period. So these are coming back to you again for final review.
Yes, I remember going through them quite in depth. So if there are any questions, Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question about something in the narrative report in section 2, which is about the council, which is page 110 of the report pack or page 9 of the appendix. So this is a narrative report about the financial year ending at the end of March 2023. But there's information here about the election in May 2023 and the change of administration, but it doesn't explain as part of the narrative why that's relevant to the financial year ending in March. And I wasn't sure, why, whether the relevance of the election on the previous financial year needs to be maybe explained in the narrative more clearly.
Yeah, we can update that. It's always a challenge for us because the accounts are as at the 31st of March. But obviously, you're discussing them now in January 2024. So we've sort of got to keep them a bit up to date as well. So when we're writing the narrative report, it's May usually. And so we tend to put in the narrative report, yes, up to the 31st of March, but we will also include anything that's happening at around the time we're writing it that is also relevant, because it's at the time it's being published, I think, rather than, so we would include that as context for the reader, really. So we can, I mean, obviously next year we won't be saying, oh, there's just been an election, because there won't have been, but certainly we can take that on board and try and make that clearer, that as well as being as at, it's not a drop dead 31st of March thing, because there'll be post-balance sheet events, there'll be other, as Mark explained about the pensions, other things happening, valuations that will alter as we go along. So we can try and make that a bit clearer in the narrative report that that's the case.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rose?
Yeah, I've got a flurry of budgety financial questions around the year, but then they're not about the accuracy of the accounts. So I just want to preempt it by saying that that's the case. But I just wanted to understand a bit around. We've heard, and perhaps I would have asked it in the original one if I knew more about the budget and I was more savvy to conversation at the time. But certainly since then, we've heard a lot more about reserves and use of reserves. And there's a bunch of things in page 131, page 153, and then particularly page 163 as earmarked reserves. It doesn't really have a breakdown of usable reserves that aren't earmarked, if you like. But in there are various millions of pounds of moving in and moving out. I guess my question is we obviously identified the overspend early in the year. We ended up in a situation where we had quite a large amount spent out of reserves. Was that something that we should have been doing more on mid-year? What should we have been doing to avoid that spend? How does it look this year on the same area? Now I'm bleeding beyond the edges of this 1 year's accounts, but I guess trying to understand whether the accounts are appropriate for what they should have been, not that they aren't adding up. Does that make sense? The question, it's a bit of a kind of, I'm just trying to get my head around this whole question of overspending reserves, the overspending the year that's identified early, but then we don't get it back down to zero during the course of the year, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's like a management accounts versus financial accounts kind of question. So the budget monitoring and the discussions we have at executive around the overspend, the management accounts during the year, that's part of our budget monitoring process, is identify there is a variance against the budget, there is an issue, we need to do something about it. The accounts before you tonight are the statutory accounts that I think we as this end of the table, as the kind of finance and auditor section, would recognise it's not easy for the casual reader, shall we say, to understand. Don't wish to offend anybody, but they're not the easiest document to understand, and I think we would love to change them and present them in a different way. Unfortunately, we are bound by the SIPFA code that we have to present them in a particular way. So these set out, like I say, the position at the 31st of March. So the reserves is an interesting point. We do have usable reserves and non-usable reserves. The usable reserves are, like the key figure actually is the general reserve, which I think shows us about 10 million on here, because I think it has schools balances in it as well. So they're the balances that we can use. When you come to the budget report, or that you saw last week at executive, you'll see that as part of my assessment, I make a recommendation for the minimum level of reserves, and that's basically saying if this reserve falls below that amount, then I consider it's not a robust budget, and we will have problems with our financial resilience in future years. But this is kind of, it's almost the actual versus the forecast, and so this is the actual position. And what we'll do at year end is we'll use the reserves that we can to offset our overspend if we need to, but if we don't need to, we won't use those reserves. So you'll know from the monitoring report during this year, we're forecasting, I think it's just over 4 million from earmarked reserves. But if we don't need 4 million, we won't take 4 million. If we need more than 4 million, then we'll have to dip into the general reserve, and that's, you know, part of the stuff in the budget report. So it all kind of links together, but you won't be able to see like a golden thread that figure there is that figure in the budget report. To be honest, the narrative statement maybe tries to articulate that, but probably not very well. So that's taken on board the earlier comments. There's probably a bit that we can do on the narrative statement to try and more clearly show you how all that links together. So we can take that away and try and improve that.
I mean, I think it's probably quite hard to do it at the summary level, because a lot of this is in the weeds. I mean, the one of the particular things that I was looking at is the subtotal general funds balance at 31st March 22 to 23. By my maths is 18.6 million worse in that 1 year, but that's not a number I've heard anywhere previously. So obviously that's not
Sorry,
what we've been talking about. We talk about, sorry, this is page 163 Annex A, or 167 if you're on there.
Because some of that will be unusable reserves in pensions and the capital.
Yeah, so well, that's what I'm trying to get my head around is it's a sizable number in its own right. B, it's a quarter to a third of the total of the general fund earmarked reserves. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is this something we've already covered when we talk about all the other reserves numbers we talk about? I'm just trying to, even after everything that I've done on training and a lot of paying attention to a lot of conversations about it, I'm still going, I don't really know what that 18.6 million gap means. Is that is that a drop in earmarked reserves, or is that us moving things around? Is that us choosing to spend less? And so a lot of these earmarked reserves are about programs and we're dropping back on programs because of financial constraints, like what does it mean in practical terms?
Well, it's worth remembering that reserves are set aside for a purpose, so they shouldn't sit there, except the general reserve, which is our rainy day money, but the other earmarked reserves are earmarked for a purpose, otherwise they wouldn't be earmarked reserves. And so they should be spent, they shouldn't be sat there indefinitely. So a reduction in reserves, from our perspective, is not, it's not, let's all run screaming for the hills. It's, they're reserves that are designed to be used. If you're using them on something else and you're using them on a recurring problem, then it does become an issue. But if you've set aside a reserve to deal with X and X happens and you use the reserve to deal with X, brilliant, well done. You had the reserve, you've dealt with it, you move on. So it's not straightforward. Like I say, the key number to keep your eye on is the general reserve, and to make sure that that doesn't fall below the minimum recommended level that I set out in the budget report. Now, if it did, I would be the first person coming to tell you about it. So, you know, but that's the key number. I won't say the rest of it isn't for you to worry about, because it clearly is. But when you look at, so the NNDR reserve is probably a really good example of one where that's to deal with business rates, isn't it, Helen? And so to deal with the timing of how business rates works, because it's not straightforward. There are delays, sometimes it's 18 months behind in terms of what we do with the government and pooling. So some of it is around timing differences as well. We'll get some money in from the government in March and we won't spend it until May. That will sit in a reserve over year end. There are lots of different reasons for holding reserves. And like I say, it's not always bad news to spend a reserve unless you are using the general reserve. That's the one where I would say it's bad news to be using it, especially if you're using it on recurring pressures.
So, and sorry if I'm saying stuff and everybody else is thinking I'm, you know, not getting it. But I'm just trying to make sure that I'm assured in my understanding of it. I totally understand the concept of balanced budget and reserves being put aside for a purpose and then being spent. I guess when I'm looking at the same dates, 31st of March each year, losing a quarter to a third of the earmarked reserves, I'd expect that to be replenished, even if it's allocated to other things. So is that because we're earmarking less for the current financial year? Is there no reason whatsoever to be concerned? I'm just wasting my time on it. But is, you know, should that number be going down? Is there danger if we then spend from the earmarked reserves year on year? What does that mean practically?
It's not. We need to keep an eye on it because we use reserves, as we've just talked about in the Treasury training earlier. You know, those cash batch reserves we'll use to, you know, manage our borrowing position, for example, and help us save money on interest, because we'll use cash so that we can delay our borrowing. So, but they're not necessarily going to be replaced because it'll just depend what's happening. So, you know, years ago we had an equal pay reserve, and then we did job evaluation and we sorted all that out. We used the reserve. You wouldn't necessarily see that replaced or replenished the following year. It would just depend. And like I say, a lot of it's timing difference. So if the government gives us some money or we get a grant and we haven't spent it in that by the 31st of March, it'll go in a reserve. But it depends when we get it and what it's for. Sometimes it will be spent, sometimes it won't be spent. So I don't know if there's any other examples, is there? I can't think of any top of my head that would explain it better. But so it's timing differences, it's risk, it's circumstance, but you wouldn't necessarily see a consistency in earmarked reserves because there will be different issues all the time. Some of them will hang around for a few years. You'll stick it there, it'll stay there for a few years because you want to make sure that the issue is definitely resolved. Sometimes you've set aside an amount and it resolves with less than you thought you needed, but you'll leave that balance there until you're absolutely certain. So it's every single one is different, I'm afraid. But does that help? I've just made it worse.
Okay, Councillor Melling.
Thank you, Chair. Again, a question about something in the narrative report. There's a couple of pages about progress in major projects, where it has kind of expected timescales for various major projects. Like it says the York Outer Ring Road dualling project. A planning decision was anticipated in early 2023, and commencement of construction was expected in late 2023. I'm looking for some other examples. Station Gateway project, it says that pre-construction activities expected to commence in February 2023. Like there's various examples like that. But then there's no update on whether those timescales were actually met. I mean, they weren't, but you know, and what the impact then is of that on the accounts. It doesn't really, like the narrative report on the accounts doesn't seem to actually link to the accounts and what the impact on the accounts was of those progress on major projects.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. We would think that those progress in those major projects would be reported, elsewhere. There are highlight reports that are published on the, through the York Open Data platform. Executive will receive updates in terms of funding changes or anything else that's happening. And like I say, the idea is just to give a flavour of the sort of things that are happening in the council to set the accounts in some context. So it's a way of saying, yeah, we are spending a lot of money, but look at all the things that are going on, and that's why we're spending a lot of money. That's why we've got borrowing, maybe that's why. So it's just to set it in a bit of context. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list of everything that's going on, because it would run it would run to pages and pages. It's already long enough, isn't it, the accounts? So it's just when I'm writing it, it's just an assessment of they're the things that are going on at the time, they're the major projects that are kind of taking up my attention at the time, so I'll tend to put them in because they're things that we're dealing with from a finance perspective. So that, again, there's no it's not like there's a process where we say, oh, we'll mention this one and not this one. It's kind of based, again, a bit on risk, a bit on what the big numbers are. So we picked these ones because they were the key things that were happening at the time. As you say, that's the problem with this, is things very quickly become out of date. But this is what was happening at the time, and so that it's just there to set these numbers in context, which are as at the 31st of March. It's just to give you some idea of what was happening. So again, we can look at how we report back on some of these changes, but they would be done through the highlight reports that are published. Could, yes, thank you, Matt. Yeah, that could be why we've got unspent money in reserve. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up on that, because other parts of the report read as if they were written, on the 31st of March, looking back at the accounts and what actually happened in the financial year, whereas this section on major projects looks like it was written at the start of the financial year, projecting what's expected.
It was all written at the same time, definitely.
Well, presumably in May 2023, it wasn't
yeah.
written that the planning application was anticipated in early 2023.
Well, yeah, I did write. Well, it's probably, when would I have written this? Would I have written this April? Yeah, I would have written it in April. So that's just my poor use of language.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I feel like that needs to be, as you said, it's a very long document. If that is going to be in there, it needs to be linked to the accounts in some way. Otherwise, it's just, taking up space, but not really explaining.
Yeah, no, I'll just take it out next time.
I enjoyed reading it.
Can I express sympathy to the finance department for the task of producing a snapshot, which is a financial year, and that is something that you then, what I will call post-balance sheet events, but you mentioned some of them, the things that you think are significant, even though the year is over. And then it arrives here several months after that was written anyway. So you've got post-balance sheet events, which are changes from the post-balance sheet events, which are things that happened after the end of the financial year that you're reporting on. And the main in-year control mechanisms that you have are while you're members of committees and you're looking at what's going on during the year, and you're getting up-to-date reports of what's going on during the year, which are always going to be more up-to-date than historic information in the financial accounts. And the financial accounts allow the external auditor to check whether the finance department know what they were doing as opposed to what they are doing, and they're accurately reporting in total what they're doing and how it relates to the overall position of being reported to you. But you are better able to manage and control around management accounts in your information on what's going on. And there's always going to be a problem of relating information that's written about a snapshot long after the information was written about the snapshot, because the damn things take so long to come to a conclusion.
Thank you. Councillor Melly.
Thanks, Chair. I had a question about external audit costs. It's on page 201 of the papers, or 100 of the annex. The external audit costs in the financial year 2022 and 2023 were almost double what they'd been the previous financial year. I was just wondering why that was, and if that was planned and budgeted for.
Yeah, there's a whole series of reasons why the costs for external audit have increased significantly. They've received an awful lot of attention and airtime, especially following the public sector audit appointment new framework contracts. So the headline report, it was almost a doubling of scale fees, and audited bodies were informed of those fee increases for audits starting from 2023-24 in September. They were subject to consultation, and that those fees were finalised in November, December. For 22-23, we carried out additional extensive and far-reaching procedures on areas that weren't included in the scale fee. Those include the areas of pension fund assurance, as has already been mentioned, in the areas of property, plant and equipment, and also the value for money arrangements. And all of those areas will be highlighted, reported to you in our annual audit report, and before any additional fees are paid, they need to be approved by public sector audit appointments. So there's an external accountability loop that includes the client, public sector audit appointments, who will approve those fees on your behalf. But as I say, the increases are due to procedures that extended beyond the procedures that were envisaged when the contract was let in 2007. And that's largely a result of additional almost instruction from the regulator, the FRC.
Thank you. That's right.
Yeah, we're not live online at the moment, are we? So I can ask proper questions. So, okay, I'm asking a question anyway. But I was just checking about how far we can delve into it. But the Guardian reporting today, and a lot of reports this week around financial state of councils in general. So this is looking more at the year ahead. But the context of all of the assets that we've got in heritage, so that's page 144. We've got all of the aspects around museum, art collection, contents, civic regalia, and everything else in there. I just wanted to check what the conversations are like in the council at the moment. I know that the general national press is talking about councils elsewhere asset stripping and having to sell loads of things off. We're not anywhere near that territory at the moment, are we? Just for sanity as to where we're at.
No, not that. I'm certainly not having any conversations about selling the art collection. Definitely not. It's not something I've been a part of. There is a saving in the budget papers proposed around selling some capital assets and the ability to either use the capital receipts flexibly to fund transformation costs, or use those capital receipts to reduce our ongoing revenue debt costs. So we will be looking at disposal of assets. But I mean, Mazars might have a view as to whether the council's accounts show a robust and resilient council. You might not, because you've probably not finished your VFM work yet, have you? So maybe they can't. Actually, now I'm looking at them. But yeah, Mazars probably see more people's accounts than I do, because I only see ours. So I don't know whether Mark has anything to add.
If it pleases you, Chair, there are on our list of places we visit local authorities that do have in their short-term plans the need to deal with financial standing issues by disposing of assets. I don't have to travel very far to be in those places, and that is a result of various things, mainly the reported cuts in council funding since 2010, and it's also suggested that some of those authorities have reached the stage where their ability to meet their need to provide statutory services is no longer supported by the income they get from the government by council tax or from fees and charges, and they are taking emergency steps to deal with gaps in their financial plans, some of which include asset sales, some of which include applying to the government for emergency additional funding. So you may well have seen the lists in the press, and the list of authorities just seems to be growing, Chair.
Thank you. And I guess this is because the sort of rumour is that you could sell things and use it to sort of fund your day-to-day spending, which isn't really something you can do at the moment for obvious sensible reasons. Is there anywhere a kind of list of everything the council owns and what the value is, and is that public and?
Yeah, it's, well, we have a system especially for it, don't we? Helen probably can tell you more about that.
Yeah, we have the fixed asset register, which will contain every asset we own, or should do, shouldn't it? So we can share details of that if the committee would like some summaries. Probably you don't want every item on there.
Yeah, and I think that would probably be a useful thing, and particularly if the government does come and say you can flog off everything, you should probably have an idea of actually how that could impact if people wanted to go down that route. It's obviously not a very sustainable one, but as being an option, it's probably something we should have sight of, I guess. I'll come to Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I think a lot of those authorities that are in the most dire straits are in dire straits because they have pursued extremely irresponsible, I think I would use that word, asset acquisition for investment. I mean, I can think of a number of councils that have gone into solar farms, that have bought shopping malls, and some of the chickens are coming home to roost on that. The reason they can then dispose of them is because that aspect, it reduces their debt, and hence the repayments on debt they have to fund out of their accounts. I don't see, having looked through these accounts, that this council is quite in that situation yet. We have a number of investment properties, but of what I gather, they are there to provide rental income, which support the actual revenue accounts. So there are sometimes assets you can dispose of which don't produce an income, which can produce a debt reduction, which will enable the council to keep going. But I'm not sure we're at that situation yet, having had a look through these accounts.
Councillor Rose, and then I'll come to.
Yeah, I mean, I echo the point that my visibility of this isn't that we're in a place where that should be the conversation. And I think it'd be good to have a look at us. I know that in the bit about Yorkshire Museum, for example, it says we don't actually evaluate all of the individual items there anyway. But noting, I mean, firstly, some of the councils aren't in a situation because of problems they've caused themselves. This is just a problem across the country. So there are some in that, definitely, but there are some that haven't caused that. And when we look at our heritage assets, we've got city walls and the Miltangular. I mean, they're things that we can't sell, right? They're things that are part of us. The whole of Yorkshire Museum and Gardens and Hospitium is a rather sizable singular asset. And then you've got the contents of the Art Museum and museums, which I'm certainly wouldn't want us to see go. I guess my question was less about the slash and burn policy of just what have we got to sell to try and escape final doom, which I guess that's where Bradford and Middlesbrough might be starting to loom towards. The places that have already had Section 114 notices probably have already had to do things like this. But there must presumably be an ongoing, reasonable, sensible thing that it talks about here about acquisition of art. Presumably there is a conversation around some of the assets that exist within the museum about, do we just continue to hoard and increase and acquire more and more things? Or is there some general movement? The logic, I guess, would be that if you've got really valuable art, that's the stuff you want to keep. And so the only things that you might be thinking about moving around with the things that are low value. But how does that work in practice, all of that heritage asset management stuff?
We'd need to get the York Museums trustee to tell you about that. We speak to them about asset valuations, we speak to them about insurance and other matters and information for the accounts, but neither Helen and myself are necessarily involved in the day-to-day sort of management of those heritage assets. Yeah, they belong to us. We set up the York Museums Trust to look after them on behalf. Well, they belong to the city, don't they? They belong to the city. We set up the York Museums Trust to look after them on behalf of the city. There certainly isn't an aggressive policy of going out and acquiring new assets, but equally, I think if something drops in their lap, they don't say no, kind of thing, But yeah, we'd have to ask somebody else to give you that information if that's something that you wanted to know more about.
Okay, well, perhaps if we stick a pin in that for the moment, and the committee can decide if it's something they'd like to have a report on later in the year.
I don't think buying, selling capital assets are where the problem lies. The problem lies in increased real terms revenue expenditure. And if you started flogging capital assets to meet your revenue costs, it wouldn't help anyway. And what's causing increased revenue expenditure? It's the difference between the rate at which income increases and the rate at which expenditure increases, including expenditure items, mainly expenditure items, of which you have no choice. So we may not be up there yet, but if you project two lines, the way in which income is going up and the way in which expenditure is going up. I don't think there's a local authority in England which is not going to have those two lines cross at some point in the future. Now, if it's more than 3 years away, you're one of the luckier and the better ones. But I'd hate to think where if you projected those lines, we would be in 3 or 4 years' time. But we are not at the front of the pack. There is a serious problem in funding local government in this country, which has a long history of the relationship between central government and local government under all political parties. And it's being acknowledged to some extent, but alas, it's going to be a big problem for the next half decade to decade because the resource sources aren't available to central government to bail out the problems that central government has caused local government over the last decade or 2 decades. So we haven't got a current problem, but we have a strategic current problem, and capital assets are just not where it's at resolving that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I guess my point I was trying to get to and didn't really enunciate was this is something that other councils are doing today. They don't want to do it. The fact that they're clearly doing it is a clear indicator they're further along that road than us. How close are we to being in the same boat as them? And what are we doing in that space at the moment? That was where my point was. I have another question on finances unrelated, if that's okay. It is a very small one because it's only a £5,000 question. But it's a question just because I don't know where we're at this year and you might have the answer. I also don't want to pry into individual circumstances, but on page 196, members' allowances expenses went up 40% between the previous financial year and that financial year. I was just wondering if you knew what the difference was, considering it was the same councillors year to year, and whether you have any idea of what that looks like this year ahead. Again, we're talking small numbers there, and it might just be inflationary, but I wasn't sure if there was any detail behind that. 196.
So this is where members' allowances have gone up in total from 829 to 842. Is that what you're saying?
And 5 to 7 on the expenses.
Oh,
the allowances, I think,
from 5 to
more dictated. The 5 to 7 was explicitly just a very small list of things we can expense.
Yeah, I don't think.
I know it's a small number, but
breakdown. I don't know what's the. I mean, we can do we'll have the detail behind it. We'll have the transaction listed behind it, so we can have a look and answer that by email afterwards.
In due course, I mean, I was thinking more at a public meeting, just because I know that when we're tightening officer costs and other council costs, it'd be good to show we're also
in the minutes
managing members' costs.
Yeah, could do that.
Can members actually claim expenses for? As far as I'm aware, it's only travel outside the local authority. And you know, it may just be that some members have been having to attend meetings in London or elsewhere because of the North Yorkshire Combined Authority or something like that.
That's about it.
I mean, considering the years in question, I suspect it might be exactly that things like West Yorkshire Combined Authority, Transport for the North were meeting online. And then in the next financial year, they went back to being in person. It's probably might just be something like that.
Okay. Can't see any further questions, so I'm happy to move on if members are. Do need to just agree the recommendation, I think. Presumably we're all happy. Yeah, can't see any dissent. As amended. Great, thank you. Okay, and thank you very much. Thank you.
There were a few amendments there that we suggested. Will the list, presumably you've made a list of all or somebody has made a list of all the amendments that we wanted. Will that list be ready for you before you're then delegated to sign off?
If I could just, the amendments that you suggested, I wouldn't, unless they would change the narrative report at this point in time, what I would do is incorporate your comments in the next one.
Okay.
If that's acceptable. Yeah.
Thank you. So if we're happy to continue, we move on then to item 8, which starts on page 289. This is the key corporate risks. Yeah, thank you.
I don't think there's a great deal to add to the report unless I'm missing anything, but so I'm happy to take questions rather than rehash the report.
Okay, are there any questions? Councillor Rose?
Yeah, sorry, I was waiting for somebody else's hand to go up first. I wonder whether on page 296, the first KCR financial pressures, I agree with the net and where we're at least short term. I wonder whether major is the right gross impact, just because when looking at the matrix of risk definitions further on, I think the impact of financial pressures would be at the top end of the impact, and I think likelihood is we know it's pretty certain at this point long term. We have then applied those mitigations, but I think if we didn't mitigate by cutting £10 million plus, that risk is as catastrophic as a risk can be, really. So I just wanted to ask that question, whether I'm missing something on that. If
It's a good point. Trying to think, but something we can take away, is it, Debbie? We can just review, because there has been a number of increases in risk. You're right, councillor, since the risk score was changed. Yeah.
Yeah, we can certainly take it away and review the score, can't we? Catastrophic's quite a big word, isn't it? That we would tend to avoid. So, but yeah, we will relook at the score as we do everything else.
yeah, I guess catastrophic is a big one, but if we're talking the word bankrupt, that's quite a big word as well. So, but as you say, things have changed. I just wasn't sure whether that was something that should be looked at or not. I've got another one, which is my only other one, thankfully, in this section, which is the local plan. On page 311, 312. I don't know much about it because I'm not on any of those relevant committees. But I just wondered whether that update is up to date. I know it says ongoing action 31st March onwards with Neil Ferris, but the fact that it doesn't look like it's mitigated from gross to net, and the fact that we were talking about it previously, what is the state around the local plan adoption? Where do we stand in terms of tangible impact of that risk at the moment?
I did get an update from the officer last week, actually, or the point when I wrote the report. So it is fairly recent. My intention had been to bring a further report to this meeting. However, because of the additional hearing that had been requested, that's mentioned in paragraph 19 of my report, there's been a delay in concluding the inspectors issuing their report on the local plan. And that's why I've not brought any further details this meeting, unfortunately. Hopefully, I wouldn't say by the February meeting of A&G, but of the next meeting after that, we would have something more concrete to bring you back. But possibly in the meantime, I could get the officer to write when there is an update to members.
I think that'd be useful if that's okay to get the update on the risk. I guess my question from an audit and governance perspective is, does that risk grow over time because it's not adopted, or is it the same risk that's not being mitigated? And does the likelihood of that being mitigated or not being mitigated change over time? Obviously, a further phase 5 hearing session, another, hopefully next time, that the longer that grows, does that change anything for us, or does that just mean that we've still got this outstanding risk?
Yeah, on the face of it, I wouldn't say the risk has increased, but I get the point that actually, whilst things are delayed, there's more uncertainty. But I think, well, I'd like to assure you that the risk hasn't increased in the meantime.
Okay, Councillor Mason.
Thanks. I suppose it goes back to what we were saying earlier when we were chatting about the Constitution. There's nothing that I could see in here, and I might have missed it, about the devolution and the new kind of joint administration and everything else. And I just wondered how all that fits together as a corporate risk. Obviously, there's powers transferring different bits of money that we might or might not get, and I just wondered where that sits in this type of framework.
We would consider it more of an opportunity than a risk. So this is not from a political perspective, clearly, but from an officer and a financial perspective, it is more of an opportunity than a risk. It brings in double the amount of money for transport than is currently received by the constituent councils. Can't be anything other than an opportunity from an officer perspective. We don't consider the political impact of that.
I suppose I get that, but at the same time, there must be a risk that comes with that something happens in terms of how that money's spent, or how we receive it, or it comes late, or we're banking all this money coming through, and then there's I don't know, feels like that. I get what you mean, it is an opportunity, but at the same time, there's also a risk that comes with it.
I don't think there's any greater risk than any other government funding we receive. So we can look at it under, when we refile the financial pressures one, we could maybe look and see if that exact point is, yeah, if there are any delays or changes in that funding that would have an impact. So we can consider it as part of that review.
Councillor Rose, was it a supplementary?
It was that exact question, but I guess a point related to it, which is, and I don't like asking for extra actions when I know everybody's busy, but there definitely is a risk in terms of the loss of control, I think, on over some of that part. For example, transport, conversations at the moment about bus route changes, etc. Some of the control of that goes away. The risk definitely is to residents. Would it be possible to kind of identify that split in? There are risks to the impacts of those decisions that are made at a higher level, where they might move funding around or change how things are delivered, versus the risk to us where probably that takes away some of our risk in finance and brings more finance to the area. I think there's a delineation there, but there's a middle ground where all of us are impacted by, for example, reputational impact, even though it's not us making the decisions. So that it would be good to see something like that, whether it's a key corporate risk or not.
Yeah, we can have a look at that and maybe liaise with Bryn just around increasing everybody's understanding about what a combined authority is, and more importantly, what it isn't. So it isn't a two-tier authority that sits above this council. It works alongside this council and North Yorkshire Council. So there's maybe something we can do just to improve everybody's understanding, and also make the point, obviously it was only created last week. We are still learning as well, and a lot of this is kind of TBC, really. Yeah, there is a lot to learn, and a lot to do. So obviously, after the election, it'll be different again. But yeah, no, we can take that away and have a look at that. It won't just be, obviously myself and Helen would have to do that across other colleagues as well. So we can have a look at something else.
Okay, Mr. Lee, and then we'll.
It's back to the matrix of KCRs in 292. This is a very artistic comment, which is there are only entries in 6 boxes against a 30-box matrix. And I understand why, but in a sense, mine are insignificant and never going to turn up here. So having them on the matrix looks, because it really should only be about major and critical, arguably moderate, but I would think it's more about major and critical. So the things look highly grouped in the middle of a big set of boxes. And a previous comment about is nothing critical and unlikely or possible. And the thing about the financial problems might sitting in there. So it just looks very, very lonely, that set of boxes in the center. And I know why the bottom isn't there. And there was a comment earlier about whether maybe there should have been something at the higher level as well.
I just make a suggestion that when we get the report in the future, we have that matrix, but with the original risk score directly above it, so that we can see them both sides. Because on the original risk score, there are some that are in other boxes higher up, and this shows that we've moved the risks downwards, I think, much more visually than you then have on the individual scores later.
Yeah, I can add that to the report.
Okay. Thank you. I can't see any further questions, so happy then. I think just to note the contents of the report and to provide any feedback, which we've done. Thank you very much. We can move on then to item 9, which is the Treasury and Management Monitor. I think this is Debbie's report.
I'll just point out that this report was considered by executive was it only last week, 25th of January. So it's here for your kind of scrutiny review. There are no policy changes or movements from the agreed strategy. I would just point out that at the time of the report, when it was written, which was the activity up to the end of November, we hadn't taken on any new borrowing. We have this week taken on some new borrowing. We've taken on £10 million, and we've just done it for a year because of interest rates. We expect them to be lower in a year's time. So we've taken it on for a year, and we'll refinance in a year's time, and hopefully interest rates would be lower. So just to mention that, because it says no new borrowing, which would have been correct if we had the meeting last week, but literally this week we've taken on some new borrowing. So I just wanted to mention that update. And it's one shows the prudential indicators, and I'll do my best to answer questions, but if they get a bit technical, if I could take them away and email back afterwards, that would help.
Okay, thank you. And I think some of us have just had Treasury management training, so we're all total experts. Councillor Rose?
I was just going to say that actually my answers were all my questions were all answered by that training, so I've got no questions now. So it's not really a question or comment for this, but I think it shows that it was an effective training session.
Yes, it'll be online for members that didn't.
Yeah, I think it was recorded on Teams, wasn't it, Lou? So it'll be available to watch again if you wish, and for those members that were unable to attend. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Hopefully it won't go viral.
Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just one of those annoying correction ones, but I also want to make sure it's not the case. Page 334, when it gets to the interest rates around 2026, it doesn't, I'm guessing that's 4.0%, and we just missed out.
Yes, I'm so sorry. It's not 40.
Okay,
Right,
good.
so sorry, but thank you for pointing that out.
Sorry for being
Yeah, that would be a
Thank
bit of a
you.
steep jump, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
It's not when we expect the new Liz Truss to be back as Prime Minister, is it? So. Okay, any further questions? No further questions for Debbie? No, thank you very much. Move on then to item 10, which is somewhere. Which is the Treasury Management Strategy Statement. So I think
Yeah,
Debbie will then.
it's another statutory report that you need to consider. It's required by the Prudential Code. It's again, it's already been to executive, but it will go to full council on the 22nd of February. So if you did have any comments, concerns, issues, amendments, we can incorporate those into the version that goes to full council for final approval. There are no significant changes to the strategy. It's kind of business as usual. We've not done anything different. We've not done anything new. It outlines the prudential indicators for the year ahead and makes a forecast for the 4 years after that, and just to match our 5-year capital programme. So there's nothing particularly exciting for me to tell you. It's a pretty standard. We've not made any changes to the usual strategy.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fisher.
Sorry, can I say one thing about the report, which is terribly trivial? At several points, it says things like red dotted line. Well, it's a bit difficult when you've got a black and white thing.
Yes, I do apologise.
We find some other way of coding them, so
yeah, we do need to find a better way to show some of this without printing in colour. I would urge you to look at it online, I guess. But yes, take your point, Councillor Fisher. We will look to make sure it's accessible.
Thank you. And it's a similar thing to the risk register, which is all grey. So various shades of grey.
Yeah, we can't afford to print in colour, I'm afraid. So I'll bring some crayons maybe next time. Give us something to do.
Councillor Rose.
Yeah, it's just a question that came from outside of the council. People were asking the questions in relation to it. But in terms of our choice of who we bank with and the rates that we have through that, there's not much in terms of the strategy of whether that's looked at regularly. And I didn't ask the question in training, but is that something that we regularly scrutinise? Are we with the best potential provider, or is there benefit in switching, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, we do consider it. It's a huge task for us to change banking provider. I know it's been made a lot easier, hasn't it, to change your bank. It's not that easy for us. We do look at it. We do regularly. We have a regular review. We don't pay a great deal in bank charges, actually. Well, you know, there's not much in it. We review it every couple of years and have a look and make sure that there's not something that we're missing in terms of a much better way of doing it, or a much more cost-effective banking provider. And so we're due to do that again, I think next year, this year, 2024, I think we're due to have another look at that again. So we keep an eye on it. But generally, even if there is a small saving in transaction charges, it's outweighed by the fact that I need a project team to deliver the change. But we do look at it, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Any further questions? No. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think our last formal item is item 11, which is the work plan. I think there are a couple of suggestions. I think bringing back some of the more sort of member training issues as well as what's in the plan for May, sort of why there's some of the issues, and perhaps getting some input from the standards committee, and then whether there's something on the sort of asset register values perhaps for later in the year if that becomes a sort of issue that could perhaps be sort of timetabled in.
Yeah, obviously we'll pick those up, Chair. I think it's probably worth noting that I certainly seem to have a meeting scheduled on the 28th of February as well. So there is actually a meeting before May, so we've got another opportunity in there. I think the observation I would make in relation to the asset register is we may just have to consider whether or not we publish that publicly. Because obviously if we're considering selling something, the last thing you need to do is advertise what we think it's worth. So we'll think about how we approach that.
Okay, well, that'd be good. No, and I think if we keep the February meeting sort of as it is, because I think that's the one where we're going to look at the constitution, so potentially it's quite a big meeting.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that that was flagged up regarding the pre-election period. I think there's a bit of guidance that perhaps needs to be provided to not only ourselves, but I think for a lot of committees and areas in terms of the specific time frame the pre-election period will take for the combined authority. Don't know if there's any guidance that can be given to us on that now.
So guidance will be coming out later on towards the beginning of February, as we do whenever we have an election coming up. So the pre-election period will start on the 26th of March, which is a Tuesday. Will run until obviously the election concludes. It won't have a great impact on York because obviously it's not a York election. It is a pan-regional election. So, and much of it is obviously about either very controversial decisions that we might be looking at or publicity that we might be putting out. Well, it's probably not going to overlap a great deal with what's going on with the combined authority, but that guidance will come out in the next couple of weeks.
One comment about wording that's being used on the programme of the 20th of February meeting, which is under finance. It says discussion of, and hopefully it isn't just an open-ended discussion. It's to receive a report on, you know, it's reacting to something, not simply discussing something, because the function of the committee wouldn't normally be to just have an open-ended discussion. I accept it's been a sensitive political subject and an issue, but pragmatically for the committee, that's not the bag of the committee.
Yes, I think that certainly is intended to be a report, I think, on the process. I think we'll think about sort of how we structure that after the meeting and who's invited, issues like that, and then also what the outcome potentially could be, rather than just
let's talk about it
and stop there. Yes. Are there any? No, Councillor Malik. I was going to say if there are any other sort of work plan related issues that sort of come up.
Yeah, there's nothing about finance in May, but I'm assuming that we'll have finance stuff in May. I don't know when the first drafts came through, but I think it came through May last year.
For the accounts?
For the accounts.
Yeah, well, they're not due to the 31st of May. We've got till the 31st of May to complete them, and we were slightly late last time, so it'll be June, July.
July meeting.
It'll be the July meeting.
Just thinking things like that we know are definitely
in
the calendar, should be in the calendar ahead probably.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We will look ahead and put those key dates on. Have we got dates beyond September?
And my other point was corporate calendar, because it's not on the agenda, but we had a conversation in passing about whether there's a way of moving up earlier when we set the calendar, whether we can do the year ahead when we're doing it, or how that works. I feel like that's an A&G thing. Is that something we can put on the work plan going forward of, can we change it so that before December we have the following year, or can we look at what that looks like long term, just to avoid us getting to this point in the year without knowing when our May meetings are, as they are now?
So my understanding is that they're looking at finalising the calendar next week. I've raised this specifically with Lindsay Tomlinson, who's the head of democratic governance. I've also raised the prospect of actually trying to do it for not only this coming year, but up until the next municipal elections. So effectively we would get at this moment a 3-year plan, and then thereafter we'd look to try and do 4-year plans so that it's clear when things are happening. The fluctuations may happen around half terms particularly because there's obviously decisions to be made about term times. But in general, we know roughly when things will be, so that it's something we're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that things fluctuate. The meetings get moved and cancelled all the time. So I don't think that necessarily prohibits us from having things in the future. But I appreciate we're about to have next year's. I'm not worried about that. It's more just, should we be talking about a policy of how we ensure that, or what we want to dictate as a ANG, or whether that should be something we put in the constitution, or how do we manage the diary? Because in general, obviously, when we're looking at the months ahead, it's worth us knowing.
And the reality is it's actually a function of council. It's something that goes to council every year for agreement, so I say my own preference would be to try and get it a much longer period of time. And once you've got sort of 3 years set in, you can wait 2 years and then set the year for year, sort of 4 and 5, and plan that far ahead. But you don't really, it's not ideal to be planning next year's when you're in this year, is my view.
Yeah, and I guess it's a constitution things in terms of how often meetings happen for each of the committees, what committees there are. It's sort of our job, I guess, to make sure that the governance around the, when those dates are, is sort of happening.
Yeah, and there's the practicality of trying to fit meetings in so that everybody can attend, and making sure that we hit the key times for individual committees. So obviously this committee needs to sit and look at the accounts at the right sort of time. There's more flexibility with, for example, CSCC, SMC, because obviously that doesn't have a set of documents that it's got to work through. So, but that's something that the Democratic Services team are factoring in.
Yeah, I guess my point would be that the earlier that we have things put in, the earlier we'll spot potential clashes, and we do have a lot of bunching. Both as council, but particularly as, for example, the lovely team who people online aren't necessarily aware spend insane hours trying to keep webcasting working, everything else. But when you suddenly have 4 days in a row where you've got an afternoon and an evening 4-hour meeting back to back, I won't suffer through all of those probably, but some people will. So if we're setting it further ahead, we can help to spread that load out a little bit better. And yes, there'll be then bunching because of moving things around half term, but Christmas, August, etc. are generally pretty stable. So
I think it's fair to say that the initial intention is there will be no meetings during the Christmas break, the Easter break, and the summer holidays as defined for schools, because councils need a break like everybody else. And obviously there's always staffing implications around those times anyway. So, and it's then working out where half terms will fall and then slotting meetings in so that they suit. Sometimes they'll fall in a half term, sometimes they won't. But...
Okay.
And the one final thing was, Claire Fole mentioned earlier about the member induction programme additions. So I know we've already got them. It's on the plan already for May to bring back the member training, LGA recommendations, etc. But all of the other recommendations from Claire, if we can slot that in at the same point, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think we pick that up. Fantastic. There's no further issues then. I think the only thing left is to say there's no urgent business, and there's no urgent business. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you.